Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Ruby live event. My name is Chef Ken Rubin. I'm the Chief Culinary Officer here at Ruby Online Culinary School. And this is a live event for open office hours, which means that we will be able to answer your questions on any topic related to food and cooking during the next hour or so. Given that these are open office hours, we'll have students from a variety of courses joining us. So we'll have I think a pretty diverse set of questions coming in from our student base, which is always pretty exciting. If you've never joined a live event before, just a quick, FYI in terms of how you participate. Basically, it's very easy. You see a little text box right next to the window where I'm speaking, and you can type in a question there. Click the black button to add it, and that puts it into a little bit of a queue on the back end to moderate. And once it's published, you have an opportunity, if you like the question, to click on that little heart, and that will pop it up a little bit higher so we get to it just a bit faster. So if you see a question that you like, just click on that little heart right next to it. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into our questions. If I'm responding to a question that you asked and you have a secondary or follow-up question, that's perfectly acceptable. If I'm unable to answer a question, I don't know the answer, or it's something that I feel might be more or better suited for a personal or individual conversation, I'll also indicate that as well. Certain things we want to make sure we're not putting into too much of a public space if it's more of an individual, personal type question. But again, any question you have on food and cooking across all of our courses are all fair game. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into some of the questions here. First question from Sandra P. I struggle with lentils and quinoa. Typically, they end up like mush. So Sandra, this is fairly common when we're thinking about cooking grains and certain types of legumes, especially lentils, which are fairly fast cooking in terms of legumes and beans and things like that. I would say if you are, constantly experiencing the outcome being one of being overly soft, you called it mush. But if it's, too soft, if it's porridge-like, if the quinoa is completely broken down and you can't really discern a texture, those are all signs that you have either too much liquid and or too much cooking time. So typically, I would say when you're cooking lentils and quinoa, depending on what the application is, the very best thing to do is to kind of, work with those products, even take notes with those products. When it comes to quinoa, I would say it's a very, very simple process. People talk about grains being 2-to-1 and things like this in terms of absorption. And I think that's, in some cases, a little bit overkill. So when I look at some grains like quinoa, I'll actually go and dial back that amount of liquid just a bit. So if I have, call it a cup of quinoa or 2 cups of quinoa, I'm going to do, instead of doubling that, I'm going to do like a 1.5, X on that. So if I have 2 cups of quinoa, I'll use 3 cups of water or stock. If I have 1 cup of quinoa, I'll use about 1.5 cups of water or stock. And, the key with quinoa is just bring it to a simmer and cover it. And just let it cook, low and slow for about 15 to 18 minutes. Lentils are a little bit different because they are just more varied by type. So if you're talking about cooking green lentils or brown lentils or red lentils, you're going to have slightly different cooking times and different expectation even of texture for those different products. So red lentils in particular, just because of their composition, just have a real tendency to kind of fall apart and become part of the overall matrix of what you're cooking. So that's sort of the expectation of red lentils. You can keep them a little bit more al dente and still have their shape, but they're going to really give off a lot of starch and create very much like a matrix, a thickening matrix with those starches surrounding it. Other lentils are going to keep their form and their shape and their toothsomeness a bit more. With those sorts of lentils, you can apply either a absorption method, essentially just cooking in their own liquid, or in some of those lentils that again keep their shape, you can do what's called a pasta method, which is you're cooking them in an excess of water until they're done and then draining it just like it were pasta. And there's pros and cons to those different approaches. Hopefully that helps you, Sandra. In one of the lessons, it recommends nut milk as a dairy alternative. I have been having Oatly low-fat oat milk in my coffee each morning. I'm curious why nut milk is recommended and not oat milk. Is there a preference in terms of health? No, Jerry. Actually, you probably need to update that task and include oat milk in there. But certainly, oat milk is just like rice milk, which has been on the market for 30 plus years, except that it's made from oats, and people, I think, appreciate the texture and the consistency and the body of oat milk because of just kind of how it drinks, how it kind of feels in your mouth, how it works in different recipes. So absolutely, that oat milk is a great product. You can also make a very similar product yourself with just a high-speed blender, oats, and water. So you might want to check that out at some point if you can. Thanks, Jerry. Next question is coming in from Emo. Can you recommend a brand of tortillas, corn and flour, that are conducive to this plant-based cooking course? Or is there a recipe for tortillas we can refer to in this course? And great question, Emo. I am a huge fan of tortillas. I eat tortillas, almost every single day. Typically, corn tortillas is my go-to. Corn tortillas are very, very easy to make. I think it's really just a 2-ingredient type recipe in most cases. What you want to do for most people is start with a product called Masa Harina. Masa Harina is a masa flour. Masa is a corn dough. So if you just go to the supermarket, there's lots of different brands. Some are organic, some are non-GMO, some are conventional. But I would start by buying some Masa Harina and just mix it with water. And that becomes the dough, that becomes the basis for your corn tortillas. Flour tortillas are also very simple. You can do a whole wheat flour or a blend of different flours. I would say with whole wheat flour tortillas, or flour tortillas in general, there are a lot of different ways to make them. The most simple way is just flour and water. You can also think about including things to give those tortillas just a little bit of airiness, a little bit of lightness. So sometimes you might see a small amount of baking powder added to those types of recipes. But essentially just a very, very easy to make flatbread. That's the whole kind of backstory on tortillas. So real simple. Just want to make sure you cook them onto a flat, dry, hot griddle or skillet. Next question. When it comes to making desserts without the use of white sugar, what are some good alternatives if a recipe calls for white sugar? So, Haley, this really depends on what your tolerance is for different kinds of sugars and how refined or how unrefined, I should say, you want those sweeteners to be. Certainly, you could go for something on one end of the spectrum, like a coconut sugar or a date sugar, or a maple sugar, and those things aren't going to be, processed the same way, but they're still simple sugars. If you're looking really for a whole food, plant-based sweetener, then we're getting in the territory of looking at leveraging essentially dehydrated fruits that have been rehydrated with a small amount of liquid and then used almost as a thick paste for sweetening desserts, or in the recipe application. Of course, in that context, it works differently than dry powdered sugar because you have this very sweet date paste or mango paste or apple paste or whatever fruit you used to create that sweetener. It's going to obviously add a lot of flavor, but it's not going to act the same way exactly in a recipe than white sugars. You've got liquid in it, you've got fiber, all these other components. They're going to change the cooking a little bit. So I would say that it all depends, Haley, on what direction you want to go. But if you're looking to eliminate all simple sugars 100%, then those whole food plant-based sweeteners might be a good option for you. Rose has a question here about her wok. Hi, I have a great stainless steel wok that gets brown oil residue I cannot remove. Why is this? Any tricks to remove or care for stainless steel? I've heard of Barkeeper's Friend, but it sounds toxic. I'm trying to avoid chemical cleaners. Thank you. So Rose, I would say that your wok, as you're using it, and after it's been seasoned, these are like living, breathing tools in some ways. These are going to have a pretty dynamic appearance that will change over time as you use the wok and as it's exposed to very high heat. You might develop some residue or some kind of coating almost. It's perfectly fine just to have that there. You don't need to remove it. As long as it's something that was natural. You don't want any residues that were the result of something unnatural. So I would say with your wok, the best thing to do is just to really get that wok nice and seasoned. So just continually season the wok, adding oil to it, baking it in the oven, heating it over the stovetop. All those things will cause some smoking and some, probably some further discoloration in terms of the wok, but it's really more of a functional aspect, right? You're trying to, affect the wok so that it becomes more non-stick or more slick for cooking on. I do know about Barkeeper's Friend that will remove those sorts of colors, but in the case of a wok, I wouldn't worry about it unless they're raised or bumpy or tacky or sticky in any way. Thank you, Rose. Next question is from Robin. Robin is asking here about submersion cooking techniques. So she asked, can you help me better understand submersion cooking in regards to the actual temperatures for each on poach, simmer, gentle boil, and rapid boil? In Forks Over Knives Task 48, it states that the degrees will vary by 50. But when they verbally tell the temps of each, it's much less. Yeah, that might, I'm not sure. I have to go to that task, Robin, and look to see what it says. It should not vary by 50 degrees. If anything, these are going to vary by 5-10 degrees or so. But let me just go through and give you the temperatures of what each one of these submersion cooking techniques is going to require. So let's start with poach. Poach is going to be your most gentle, lowest temperature, let's call it least invasive type cooking technique. It's not going to cause a lot of agitation. It's not going to cook anything too quickly. It's going to be a very, very gentle, easy way to cook products. And typically when you're talking about poaching, you're talking about things that are somewhat delicate. So in poaching, you're talking about at the high end, people will dispute this, but at the high end, you're looking at about 180 or 185 degrees. I typically stop my poaching at about 180, even though I might start my poaching liquid higher. Once I submerge my food in there, it's going to naturally reduce that temperature down to about 180. So I would say if you're looking at poaching, 140-ish to 180-ish is going to be a good range. Now, of course, you can poach at higher temperatures, but we would call that kind of a hard poach. And that's something where you're really going to need to be careful about the temperature. Once you get into that higher range, you're beginning to approach, simmering and things like this. So there's always going to be some gradation in here, though. So poaching is going to be your least amount of heat and your most gentle approach. Simmering is really going to be on a range of things. You're going to start to get the formation of larger bubbles that might kind of go to the surface in a more irregular timing, right around 195 or 200 Fahrenheit. Once you get just above that, you're going to be in a proper simmer. And once you get to 208, 210, 212, you'll be in a boil. And rapid boil is really at that 212 Fahrenheit temperature, provided that you're at kind of you don't have any altitude, you're at kind of a low altitude, say under 500 feet or under 1,000 feet. Because once you get above that into the thousands of feet in terms of altitude, it'll actually change your boiling temperatures a bit. So hopefully that helps you, Robin. I would say that for a lot of cooking applications with vegetables, as it relates to forks over knives, simmering is going to be really a good technique for you. It's going to provide enough heat that they will cook, but not so much that you might overdo vegetables or cause too much undue agitation. So I'd be looking for simmering right in that 200 to 205 degree type temperature range. Great question, though. Thank you, Robin. Jill says, I am finding it takes a long time for me to wash and prepare fresh vegetables. Are there food safety concerns with them being unrefrigerated and uncooked for several hours? I think that if you're washing veggies, one thing to do is just wash them and then put them back into the refrigerator. They're going to certainly hold up a lot better in that context. If they're on your counter for 30 minutes or an hour, that's probably fine. But if it's several hours, you might want to rethink that. So typically my mode of operations with this is I'll prep my veggies and then I'll just go straight into mise en place and cooking them. So it might just be 30 or 60 minutes until they're actually cooked. Otherwise, you might consider prepping your vegetables and then just refrigerating them again. And that way, all you need to do when you start cooking is pull them out of the fridge. You've got your containers with everything already washed and sliced and diced, and you're just doing the cooking at that point. I tried to make a vegetable stock. I didn't have a strainer, but at the market purchased organic unbleached cheesecloth that said it was for cooking, straining, and cleaning. I boiled it 5 minutes, put it in a colander. The green stock turned red and brown. Jill, I'm not sure exactly what is going on there. Certainly if your stock has lots of different vegetables and starts with some green vegetables, if there's anything acidic in there, you might have some coloration change, certainly. I'm not sure what happened if the straining worked or if it didn't work, but typically what I would say is if you buy a cheesecloth, it doesn't need to be boiled. You just soak it in water just for a second, just to let it get moist, and then you can put it into your colander and let it strain. If you already had a colander, it's probably a pretty good thing just to start with that. I would say that stock generally, there's not going to have a lot of really big pieces of matter in there, so you want to put it through a colander. That's probably sufficient. If you take your stock, strain it through a colander, no cheesecloth, and have it in a big container, you'll notice over time that it'll settle out. Those little particles will kind of settle out, and you can almost just pour it off, basically, pour off the top. Next question here. Frozen vegetables defrosted on the trip home. One package said not to thaw before cooking. Another said not to refreeze. Food safety issue, throw away, better way to transport. So Jill, you might transport in a cooler. That's the simplest way to do it is just put a cooler in your car. And when you go to the store and you have cold things, instead of leaving them in the bag in the back seat, just put them in the cooler. It'll keep it very, very cold. So that's the easy thing to do is just keep a cooler in the trunk and just put your most sensitive items in there. With regard to the vegetables, I wouldn't say it's more of a food safety issue. If you had some peas that thawed, perfectly fine to refreeze them. You might have some change in texture or some change in some of the integrity, but I wouldn't just throw it away or feel compelled to use it at that moment. In terms of not thawing before cooking, they oftentimes say that because if people take a bag of frozen veggies and put it in their fridge to thaw it, it might sit there for a day or two or three, essentially just sitting in that liquid, right? So when it thaws, you're going to have some thawing of water crystals, and you're going to have some ice and things in that bag just by natural extension. And you just don't want to have a bag of vegetables kind of sitting in liquid in the fridge for some period of days. So that was the rationale for, do not thaw before cooking. It really just is implying that those things cook very, very quickly, and it'll probably be covered by the natural cooking of the dish. So if you're adding frozen diced carrots to a soup, just add them in frozen, and as the soup is simmering or boiling, those will cook. You don't have to you don't have to defrost it before you cook it. Hopefully that helps you there, Jill. Michael has a question here about forks over knives. While I understand that FOK abhors oils, in the past it has been my understanding that the use of olive oil and butter have chemical reaction that bonds to flavors of aromatics like garlic, onion, rosemary, etc. So yeah, Michael, you're absolutely right. So forks over knives doesn't use oil for health reasons specifically. It's not about the culinary application of them. It's really just about the health outcomes with diets that are high in oil. So in terms of flavor, you're absolutely right. Flavors in food, all those volatile compounds and aromatics in food, typically are going to be bound by a lipid or by alcohol. So it's a great way to increase flavor or to have better diffusion of flavor in a recipe through the use of oil or alcohol, just from a technical kind of theoretical perspective, let's say. Now, knowing that and knowing the restrictions or the limitations within forks over knives, what they're saying is, well, we're not going to use those fats. We're going to get absorption of our nutrients through oils that exist in natural foods and olives and nuts and avocados and things like that. But we're not going to really focus on the flavor dynamic of those sorts of things. So you can still get a lot of flavors to transfer and carry using water or using stock as sort of water soluble approaches. And I would say that you might not have quite the intensity of some of those flavors, but certainly you can still develop amazing flavor with just using those water or stock based applications. Certain things I would say do a better job of carrying in both or versus one or the other. When you look at something like rosemary, certainly a little bit of fat in a recipe is going to help carry that rosemary, but otherwise is a very, very pronounced, robust flavor that even if you just had water or some other way to carry it, it would still be very, very powerful. Next question here. I'm making a lot of delicious food now, and I'd like to learn more about plating so they look as good as they taste. I did the plating membership course. Where can I learn more? Thanks. So Sharon, that plating mini course, I would say is probably the best place to start. If you want to continue your plating activities, I might suggest that you take another course or courses at Rouxbe where you are asked to complete what we call image upload activities. And these activities are basically activities where you're taking pictures of your cooking and you're plating them as the final shot, the final image, and then you're uploading those to our team for evaluation. So it's in those image upload activities that I think a lot of people get great ideas, they get to practice, they get to learn from others, but certainly plating is going to be, I think, super important for the aesthetics of food, to get a sense of, well, gosh, that looks really awesome. I know it looks good. I know it's going to taste good. It was made with integrity and great products. So great start there. Vanessa says, how do you decide what length and type of knife to purchase for your first time? I have very small hands and trouble finding a comfortable knife. So my suggestion, Vanessa, is that you just want to be able to, if you're comfortable at this point going to a store like a Williams Sonoma or a store that sells kitchen products, kitchen supplies, the best thing to do is just to pick it up and hold it. There's no substitute for putting it in your hand and feeling the weight, feeling the balance, feeling just kind of how it feels with your grip. And using that to determine what type of knife you buy. It's a hard thing to have someone else do for you because all of our hands are going to be a little bit different. We also have different ways of cooking and different styles of cooking. So I tend to like knives that are a little bit more on the light side versus the heavy side because I'm not cutting through bones and things like that. If I was using a traditional chef knife. So I like lighter, more Japanese inspired type knives. Typically for most people, You don't need to have anything more than around 8 inches of length on your knife. When I was a working chef, I would use a 10-inch knife just because it did a little bit more work for you in the same amount of time in terms of the size of that blade. But I would say for most people, 6 or 8 inches, a conventional looking chef knife or something similar is going to be perfect. But in terms of the grip, way it feels in your hand, the only way to really get through that is to hold it yourself. Carol G, can you explain how to keep spiral zucchini from getting mushy when using it for pasta? Oh, good question, Carol. This is something I've experimented with just a bit. It's kind of fun in the summertime, especially when you have lots of squash, lots of zucchini coming out to do some spiraled zucchini pasta. I would say the key thing around the zucchini pasta is, number one, choosing really nice, firm zucchini to start with. If you're choosing a zucchini that is mushy or has just kind of a mushiness to it, which sometimes happens with older or larger zucchini. It just might not hold up as well. So you want to just make sure it's nice and fresh and really kind of feels solid. It should feel heavy for its size, let's say. So start with that. I would say the second thing is don't dress that zucchini until maybe 10 or 15 minutes before you're ready to eat. You want to do it right before, because you do want that zucchini to give off some liquid and to let those flavors mingle and incorporate a bit. So I think there's some benefit to having it sit. But if you let it sit too long, certainly any acid or salt or other ingredients in there might begin to break it down. So hopefully that supports you. Usually just a matter of timing there, Carol. If you have little to no professional cooking experience, how would you go about getting that experience? Is it appropriate to cold visit an establishment that you want to work for? I would say, Samantha, I wouldn't just visit. I would certainly call first. The important thing is that when you go in, that you have something specific in mind. You don't just want to go in and say, hey, like, I'm this person. How can I help you? You want to come in kind of with a bit of a narrative. Here's who I am. Here's my goal. I've been following your restaurant. I know a lot about it. I know what's on the menu. I'm familiar with the ingredients. You want to be able to go in so that they're not thinking about you as a liability, but you're going in as an asset. So if you want to go do a stage, which is what we call this, it's basically just a way to test the waters a bit. I would definitely call first, call at the appropriate time, not during the lunch hour or the dinner rush. And that's to speak to someone who can really make that decision for you. And then you want to go in person and spend your first day and really be prepared. Be prepared to listen, to follow instructions, to be observant, not to be destructive or to take away from anything in their operation. That's just an important first step here. Zara asks, what is the passing grade for the certificate? I'd have to look back, but I think it's 70%. I know that we have the ability in courses to change those numbers a bit, but my understanding that for most courses, it's a 70% threshold for passing there. Osnat asks, hi, Chef Ken. I was wondering, what is the functionality of the white wine vinegar in the Thai coconut squash soup recipe? When do you add vinegar to soups? I also wanted to thank Ruby for this amazing opportunity. Ruby provides, I've learned so much. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful that you can join us. In terms of adding vinegar to a soup, in this case, it's the Thai coconut squash soup recipe. That is a very rich recipe. It has amazing depth of flavor. It has coconut milk, which adds mouthfeel and kind of a luxurious texture and some fat to it. Because of that richness, the vinegar in this case is going to help add some acidity. The acidity is going to counteract the richness, the fattiness of some of the coconut milk. It's going to provide also, in addition, some kind of high notes, some accent points in terms of the flavor of the dish that will play against some of those more baseline flavors that you might get from the squash or some of the elements in that recipe. So really, it's about elevating the dish. It's about creating a little bit of a pop. You'll also know that when you're using vinegar, it creates kind of a salad, like a response to your mouth where you kind of like salivate a little bit more. So the idea is that you're going to be balancing a dish so you have a combination of richness, of acidity, which creates that brightness, some sweet components, some salty components. All those things are going to make that dish really, really dynamic. That's the thing about food that will make it so that when you take a bite and you begin to experience it, that you want to take that next bite to go into that next kind of flavor arc. So the vinegar serves a really important function. I frankly think that people overlook acid oftentimes when they're cooking generally. So it's a great thing to do when you're thinking about cooking is, what would acid do to this dish in terms of lifting it, adding life to this dish? Do you have any tips on starting to give cooking classes or courses? I perpetually feel like I don't know enough. I would say you probably know more than you think you know. You probably have a lot more knowledge kind of embedded in your brain, or something that you could live through your body than you might give yourself credit for. So the first thing is just have some confidence in the knowledge that you have. Think about that perspective from what you know versus maybe what the other people in the class might know. And that's going to be important. It's not about knowing everything. It's about knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, but also knowing where to find the answers for things. So if you're, prepping for a class and there's certain areas that are blind spots, certainly go back and review some things. But it's also okay to tell a student in a class, I don't know the answer to that, or I don't know the answer to that in this context. And as long as you know where to go to find those answers, then you're all set. I think people appreciate that just as much. Jerry asked, how do you spell Masa Harina? You got the first part right there, Jerry. The second part is Harina. There, Patrick just spelled it for you. So it just simply means dough flour. That's what it translates to in Spanish. If you just did a quick Google search, you'll find lots of different brands for Masa Harina. There's a great brand of blue corn Masa Harina that I buy from a company called Goldmine, online company called Goldmine. Next question, what are your secrets to good curries? Mine are never as good as in restaurants. Well, restaurants tend to load their food full of maybe sometimes a little bit more fat, a little more salt, even in some restaurants, more sugar than what you might want to cook with at home. So there are certainly tricks to the trade that chefs will do to make food taste, extra good, extra special. They're not always the most healthful additions. I would say in terms of secrets to curry, for me, it's all about flavor balance and having really bright, deep, and robust flavors that you're using. Another secret, I think, for curries is not just to depend on the curry itself for the flavor, but really to let the vegetables in the curry do a lot of the work for you. So it's why I like to choose, exceptional quality vegetables. You want to cook them to the right level of doneness. And the vegetables themselves can also represent a variety of flavors. So you can have some sweet components, perhaps with something like squash or pumpkin. You could have some, kind of components that have some bitter elements like pepper. You can have herbal or aromatic elements with fresh herbs like cilantro or Thai basil and things like this. So really, it's a matter of blending these things together. Jill has a question. I am having a problem with insects in fresh organic produce. When do you clean? When do you cut around, and when do you discard? How do you clean? Are leafy greens safe when covered with insect holes and bites? So Jill, yeah, if you have, if you go to the store or the farmer's market or out to your garden and you see your greens that have some little insect bites or holes, That's fine. That just means that an insect visited and had lunch and moved along. The thing that you want to be careful of are, actually having larvae or actual insects in your food. Those are all things that if you, for instance, wash your lettuce in water, and you're just doing a good rinse, all those things will actually float out of the produce when you cut it. I would say if it's just, evidence that some little critter, some little bug took a few bites, that's fine. I would just wash that. I wouldn't cut around it or discard it. If you really have, an insect who's laid eggs inside of something or it's growing inside of something, that's when you want to take those extra precautions and cut around it or discard it, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Jill says, another question, my lowest setting on the stove seems too high and grains are burning. What can I do? Oh gosh, Jill. It really just depends on your stove. If it's a gas range, they make kind of aftermarket heat shields, things that you can put on top of your burner to create a little bit of an extra gap or to prevent hot spots from your burner. You might, if it's a gas range, check the amount of pressure coming out of your source, because if it's really, really high pressure, you might actually be having more gas than what you need coming out of those burners. But otherwise, if you're doing grains on your stovetop and it's not working and they're burning, you might want to try to put those grains in the oven. So in other words, if you're cooking grains, bring them to a simmer on the stovetop in a heat-proof pan. Once you bring it to a simmer, pop it into a 350-degree oven or 325. And because it's hot and above the simmering or boiling temperature, because it's covered, you'll essentially be just cooking that, without all those hot spots, without the fear of it burning. So it's just a matter of kind of tweaking that expectation a little bit. But I do a lot of cooking of grains in the oven, especially if I don't want to kind of baby the stovetop and those sorts of things. So the oven is a great place for batch cooking grains, or if you're having those kind of scorching issues. Next question, when would you use dried tarragon in vegan cooking? I know it's usually a herb used in chicken. I have some that I've just never really used since switching to plant-based. So I would say, number one, if it's dried tarragon, I'm not a huge fan of dried tarragon. It's one of those herbs that I think does very much better in a fresh form. You can use dried tarragon if you're making a reduction or you're trying to infuse a small amount of flavor into a vinegar or something like that. But really, I think ideally tarragon fresh is a whole different beast. It's going to do your food a lot better. When it comes to plant-based, I use tarragon in vegetables all the time. I love using tarragon. It goes really well, in my opinion, with spring vegetables. So asparagus, carrots, all delicious with tarragon. So I've done fiddlehead ferns with tarragon, which is delicious. Even just certain sorts of beans with tarragon is really good. So green beans, just quickly, blanched with some tarragon is delicious. You'll get a kind of that anise scent from it. But I would just begin to experiment. Let your mouth let you know what it likes versus going into it with some assumptions. Question here from Carla. Hello, Ken. I have two questions. First, I don't have a food processor, but I do have a Vitamix blender. Will it work when recipes call for a crumbly result? I'm thinking about the pie crust for the chocolate cream pie. So I would say yes and no. You could use a Vitamix blender to do this, but you're going to have to make it in multiple batches that are very, very small. So a food processor is just going to work a little bit easier. You can put all the pecans or all the nuts in at once and just have a much easier time at it. I would say you could do it in a Vitamix, but that blending chamber is very small. So you're going to have to add just a few, give them a whirl, empty it, and just repeat that process so you can get those small crumbles that will kind of stick together. So hopefully that helps you on your question about the food processor. I will say, just as a caveat, some Vitamix models do have a slightly wider base where that blade spins. So if your base is a little bit wider than, say, the model that I have, you might have better luck with grinding of seeds or nuts and those sorts of things. Her second question is, what is a food anthropologist? So great question. So my background, of course, is as a chef and chef educator, but also as a food anthropologist. And a food anthropologist essentially is a person who studies the intersection of food and culture. So my formal academic training is in social cultural anthropology, and my focus was exclusively on food and cooking. So basically, it's looking at the intersection of why people from different cultures eat different foods. What are those cultural, social, historical, political, religious, aesthetic underpinnings for the foods that we eat? It seeks to answer the question or address the question of, you are what you eat, that sort of a line of thinking. Next question here. I've learned that I need to have a greater proportion of leafy greens on my plate. That's the truth, Jerry. I think most of us could probably use more leafy greens. However, I don't know everything that qualifies as a leafy green. Clearly, spinach, Swiss chard, lettuce fit in that category, but what about others like cauliflower? So I would say when you think about your green leafies, you want to think about those dark, hardier type greens. Lettuce is a little bit on the edge. It's not going to have quite, in many cases, I should say, not going to have quite the same density as a spinach, a chard, a kale, a mustard, a collard, those sorts of greens. Cauliflower has greens it's attached to it, but really cauliflower, broccoli, different types of robs and those things are going to be a little bit different in terms of the characteristics. They're still delicious, they're still cruciferous, and they're still very, very powerful, but they're not going to be quite the same as those incredibly chlorophyll and nitric acid rich foods. Do you have any tricks to increase the shelf life of already blended smoothies? Oh gosh, great question. This is something I always struggle with because I have a tendency to make too much smoothie, as I think probably some people do. And I sometimes think that, I'll make this much and my kids will want it. And then they wake up and they're like, I don't want a smoothie. I want to do something else. Oh, okay, so now I have to get the smoothie packed away. So my typical mode is I will take those smoothies and I'll put them into a pint canning jar. So just a glass pint container. The wide mouth works best because you can also use it as a cup. And just pour your smoothie straight from your blender into that. Put the lid on it, put it in the fridge. I typically put it in the fridge with a label on it that has the date. So I know that was the smoothie from today, which means I probably want to drink it today, maybe tomorrow. But otherwise, if I go more than another day, I'm going to run the risk of having some off flavors, maybe some oxidation, which would change the color. Maybe not the best option for me. So typically I'll just make it, I'll store it. I'll make sure I put the sticky tab or the label on it so that it's very evident visually when I open up the fridge that I'm looking at something that I need to prioritize my consumption for. Next question, is it necessary to use probiotic powders when making non-dairy yogurt? If so, how much? So Ricky, I would say that it's not 100% necessary, but they definitely help. Using probiotic powders, create just the context for different growth and different microorganism growth, different kinds of kind of living organisms that are going to be important for that. So when you look at your yogurt containers or your plant-based yogurt containers, you'll see that it says things like, contains 5 billion active organisms, and they'll make a list. They'll say it's got different types of lactobacillus, bifidus, and different sorts of things. And you just want to make sure that the probiotic powder that you're using provides those things. Now, certainly, you can still create a non-dairy yogurt and a a response that creates yogurt using just natural probiotics that are in the air, right? So it's a combination of different living things that you can certainly use to ferment and create that lactobacillus fermentation within non-dairy yogurt. I would say that using the probiotic powder is a way to kickstart it. It's a way to guarantee that you have those specific probiotics occurring in your product. So hopefully that helps. In terms of how much, not much. It just really depends on the potency. I know the potency of some of these products has gone up a lot in the last number of years. So you should be fine with a partial dose or a dose of those probiotics. You might open up the capsule, add some of that, mix it. Again, it's just a matter of time. It's just reproducing. It's just multiplying. Next question here. I am gluten-free, but also rice, almond, dairy, and yeast-free. Do you have any great alternatives for making a flour to use for baked goods, or one that will work as a good substitute for wheat? Thanks in advance. So, gosh, tricky question. So you have some allergies to think about. You can't do any yeast, and I'm assuming that you can't do wild yeast as well. So things like sourdough and natural ferments would be out for you. So really what you're left with are things that we would classify as either mechanical leaveners, things that use just straight steam to leaven, or things that we classify as a chemical leavener. So something like a baking powder or a baking soda or a combination of those things that is activated through a combination of acid and or heat. So my guess is that you should be looking at baked goods, probably in the quick bread category, that use one of those chemical leaveners. So it's called baking powder, just for sake of argument. So these breads are going to be much different than a yeast leavened loaf, let's call it. So the idea here is you're creating small quick breads. These are things that can look like muffins or small baked goods or flatbreads. Much different scenario than with a big fluffy loaf of bread. So that's going to be kind of what you're looking for. In terms of flours, I would suggest sorghum flour as a good starting point. You might also look at things like sweet rice flour. Those are products that are going to have some tackiness and some consistency building properties that are going to be important as well. Some of the other flours that are gluten-free tend to be very starch heavy, and you might ultimately decide to use some of those things, but I would stick with sorghum flour, maybe even a blend of different rice flours as a good starting point. One other thing to consider when you're considering baked goods in this sort of a context really has to do with what is that ultimate texture that you're going for. Next question here. Sometimes the eggplants I cook come out bitter, even when I salt them before. Does this have to do with seed size, male or female, or maybe how long thin ones versus the chubby ones? How to know if it will be bitter before cooking? I would say most eggplants these days should not be bitter. If it's bitter, it could be just a result of the particular eggplant itself. Maybe it's a result of the variety of eggplant, but I would say that most eggplants these days, typically are not going to be bitter. You want to salt them. If they are bitter, you might think about maybe peeling them first or providing some other treatment to remove that bitterness. Even salting most eggplants these days, I don't find removes the bitterness, because I don't find that lots of eggplant these days has initial bitterness to start with. Interested in tortilla recipe? Also, I'm in Canada and can't seem to find corn tortillas. Corn tortillas are very simple to make. It's just masa, harina, and water. So if you find the package, you'll see the recipe clearly on the back of that package. Next question here. Same problem as Sandra P with lentils. Here we go here. Lentils are mushy. So the lentils that are mushy, My suggestion would be just to cook them for less time and with less liquid. That's going to be the important thing there. Next question here. My new stainless steel pan instructions state that you should never leave the pan on a live burner without something in it for cooking. I'm concerned that when I leave it for the water test that I'm harming my pan. Should I be worried? Probably not, Susan. You just don't want to heat your pan to excess. But, typically most chefs put a pan on the stove, heat it up before anything else goes in. So I'm not sure what the brand is or what they're worried about, but most stainless steel pans should not have any issues whatsoever with that sort of a treatment. But if it's a special kind of pan, Susan, if you want to let us know, maybe there's something out there that we're just not aware of. Next question from Manuel. Would you recommend including seitan on our diet? I've read a lot of controversial articles about it. So, seitan is just wheat, gluten, protein, right? So if you eat bread, you eat gluten from wheat. So there's nothing bad about it. There's nothing evil about it. If you have an aversion or if you're not interested in eating gluten, then certainly it'll be controversial. But if you're a person who tolerates the protein from wheat, which is seitan, that gluten, you should be perfectly fine. No issue whatsoever. Hi, chef. I have a passion for cooking, but sometimes I struggle to make good from other cultures. Do you think for a chef to succeed, he or she must cook all types of food? Arnold, no. I think that you can have one type of food that works well for you, and that's fine. There's a huge universe of food out there. You don't have to worry about cooking all the different cuisines of the world. Carol says, so when do you add vinegar to a soup? Carol, that's up to you. It's going to be depending on your mouth. So depending on how much acid you want, you can add vinegar at the beginning, the middle, or the end, or all three. I usually taste the soup before I add any acid, and I usually want to make sure the soup is fully cooked in terms of the vegetables before I add any acid, because acid can inhibit the softness of those vegetables. Often when I add chickpea flour to things, it imparts a bitter flavor. Why is that? Does it need to be fried? So good question. Chickpea flour can have some bitterness, but it also just has a real kind of beany flavor. So I would say, depending on what you're using it for, you might want to cut it with another flour that's a little bit more neutral. It's also a very, very high protein flour. So in a lot of baked goods, you're going to want to have a little bit more starch for starch gelatinization and texture. I wouldn't say you have to fry it, but certainly you want to cook it and include other flavors that might diminish some of that bitterness. I'm personally a huge fan of chickpea flour. I use it in chickpea crepes a lot, which I basically enhance from a flavor perspective using, I use a lot of different things, but one of my go-tos in terms of what I use in terms of that particular recipe are some preserved lemon, so a small amount of preserved lemon, and then some fresh herbs. And I find that those two things together really help with the overall flavor profile. It looks like that does it for all of our questions today. Thank you all again for joining. Had some really wonderful questions. If I didn't get to your question or wasn't able to answer your question in full, please do reach out to us directly. We're always happy to help. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in class, and happy cooking. Take care.